Rebecca Powell, Minister.
Thank you so much, Sir Robert, and it's a pleasure to have you there in the chair for what I think has been a most delightful morning and start to the morning. Kicked off, of course, by the effervescent honourable friend from Lichfield, who I expected nothing less, of course, brings a real passion to the subject, and I know that it is something that you've spoken about many times. I've heard you speaking before, and he also brought to it his acting skills. His Ohio accent, and I think that all really helped to bring the whole subject to light. But also, what a wonderful array of colleagues we had here, Sir Robert. We actually had no less than 10 Conservative colleagues here at one point on this side. I do wonder where our Labour colleagues are. Maybe they are not so passionate about canals as we are. But I, of course, do not include the honourable member from Strangford, who is ever here and brought to light the canals in his area. But of course, I'm speaking about English and Wales canals, not obviously Scottish and Northern Irish. You sort yourselves out and run yourselves. But it was equally lovely to hear about your canals. But what a cornucopia of canals we heard about right across the country. I'm struck also by all the stories that everybody told, particularly the engagement of volunteers and so forth. But all these great names. So we've had the Erewash Canal, we've had the Worley and Essington Canal, we've had a whole lot from the Cotswolds. I think you put them under the Cotswold hat. Oh, my honourable friend puts them under the Cotswold hat, don't you? With the Stroud Water, the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal and the Severn Canal are all in that area, aren't they? So my honourable friend is spoilt for choice. And we've got the Walsham and Dillon Canal, small but becoming perfectly formed for all the work. I myself, Sir Robert, have had quite an association with the Kennet and Avon Canal. It ran right past my school, actually, in the centre of Bath. So it was played quite a big role in that we would go out there for art classes, we'd walk along there. I think I met my first boyfriend on a sponsored walk along the canal from Bath to Bradford-on-Avon. So I've never forgotten it. And actually, my husband and his mates always used to do some sort of activity every year, and the very last activity he went on with his group of lads was, before he died, was on the Kennet and Avon Canal. It was in November, it was pouring with rain, he was on crutches, but they still had the most magical time. So I remember it with great fondness, and that's what you can do on a canal, I think. And equally, it was mentioned before, I think, by the honourable friend from Lichfield. I live now near the Bridgewater and Taunton Canal, and as with many other colleagues, it was a go-to place to walk along during COVID, during that lockdown downtime, and so important. And we've heard about all the benefits that our canals bring, the huge public benefits for enjoyment, for leisure, for recreation, waterside holidays, as my husband went on, canoeing. Paddleboarding has become incredibly popular, hasn't it? I suppose it's quite useful to do on a canal because there are no waves, I suppose, unless a boat passes. But all of those great benefits and the history and the industrial heritage and so forth, and the huge mental health and well-being impacts you get from walking along the canal. I mean, just recently and during lockdown, we regularly used to see kingfishers. Even with all those people walking along the path, the kingfishers were still not afraid because it was their habitat and their home. And we've heard about the amazing green corridors that canals can forge through our countryside, particularly in cities and towns, actually. And I have to take issue with the Shadow Minister, because this government is doing a great deal of work on reintroducing biodiversity in nature and setting targets for just that. And canals form a very important part of it. And the United Kingdom's largest navigation authority is the Canal and Rivers Trust, as we've heard. And similarly, I think it's been referred to, there are something like 800 million visits made to our canals every year, which is pretty phenomenal and shows just how important they are. And so looking into the future, our waterways and our navigational authorities have a really important part to play in helping ensure that this critical infrastructure, really, this important piece of our infrastructure is resilient to climate change and is helping to meet our net zero targets through sustainable transport and energy generation. And actually, it's also been referred to that transfer of water security is becoming an increasingly important issue. I'm the Water Minister. It's one of the hats that I wear, I'm pleased to say. And this issue of water security is as important as all the other aspects of water that we are now tackling, water demand and so forth. And of course, climate change is really triggering changes, triggering extreme weather events, and that a government is obviously developing policies to adapt to climate change right across the country. And I know that our navigational authorities too are exploring ways in which they can adapt the network to climate change as well, and also to contribute to net zero with their infrastructure. And that includes examining the feasibility of increasing electrification of the networks and encouraging our boaters to switch to electric vessels. And earlier this year, the Broads Authority, with funding from the Department of Transport's Clean Maritime Demonstration Competition, examined the potential for the electrification of the Broads hire boat fleet. And the Environment Agency has installed a number of electric charging points along the non-tidal River Thames, and the Canal and River Trust has also installed electric charging points on a few of its London canals, including a trial eco-mooring zone on the Regent's Canal, part funded by DEFRA, and the London Borough of Islington. Of course, I'll give way.
Thank you, Sir Robert. The Minister is setting out some fantastic examples of how we can help the waterways adapt to the future with electric points and so forth. But one of the areas that really concerns me is the ageing infrastructure that we have. And looking ahead is fantastic. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But can she reassure me that the government will play its part when it comes to the maintenance and restoration of the infrastructure that we have today?
I thank you for that very pertinent point. I'll refer to it a bit later in my speech, but it's a really serious point, and indeed, of course, infrastructure is affected by climate change and these extremes of weather. It is putting more pressure on some of these assets. I also wanted to mention, as well as electrification and opportunities there are similar opportunities with active travel and the cycle networks along our canals as well, allowing people to get away from roadsides and travel in a much fresher, clean air type of environment. And all of that, the more people that we can get to take to their bikes, of course, that helps us reduce carbon emissions and tackle the net zero targets. And I just wanted to go back to water security a little bit. This is really important, and our navigation authorities do have an important role to play in this, in times of both flooding, but also in times of drought. The navigation authorities can help by managing water levels, and the long dry spells this summer have really highlighted how the canal network can play a role, or could increasingly play a role, in that water transfer as we take water, particularly from west to east. My honourable friend from Stroud mentioned it, taking water from the wet west across the east. All of these things obviously have to be carefully worked out. I've spoken to the Canals Trust actually about it when I've been on some of my visits, about how these opportunities would work. I particularly welcome Affinity Water's plan to work with the Canal and Rivers Trust to transfer water through the Grand Union Canal. And I know others are looking at opportunities here. And of course, as has been touched on, the network has a really important historical value, much of it being over 200 years old. It matters a great deal to people, and there's a lot of restoration work underway. We've heard so much about volunteers, and I too would like to thank them, Sir Robert. So many volunteers have played such a role in restoring sections of our our canals, and I particularly wanted to mention I had a wonderful trip to the Monty Canal in Montgomeryshire, where I met lots of volunteers there and saw the work they were doing. They've actually benefited as well from a £16 million Levelling Up Fund grant. Others have mentioned the levelling up benefits of canals, and that money there is being well spent in the community to restore this fantastic canal, actually, in the centre of the town. Of course I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. And whilst she's talking about funding, I just wonder if I could push her, because the funding announcement that was to be made for the Canal and River Trust back in July, I'm wondering when we can expect that announcement. And rather than the parliamentary shortly, could we have an actual date?
I thank her for that, and she obviously mentioned this in her speech, as did others. So I'm going to come on to that section now. Many have mentioned the annual grant to the Canal and River Trust, and so I just want to explain a bit about the grant and how it happened and the history around it. The grant stands at £52.6 million until 2027 and currently represents about 1/4 of the Trust's annual income, and that means that the Trust derives 3/4 of its annual income from other sources. This distinction is very important because one of the objectives of the Trust when it was created in 2012 with charitable status was that it would be free of the public sector constraints that its predecessor, British Waterways, was subject to. And freedom from public sector constraints meant that the Trust would be free to develop other income generation strategies, including, for example, benefiting from charitable donations and legacies, charity tax reliefs, third-party project funding and borrowing on the financial markets. And it's worth mentioning here as well that the Trust was also endowed by the government in 2012 with a significant property and investment portfolio currently valued at around £1.1 billion, and the returns from which were also to be used as income. And the clear intent behind this was that the Trust would reduce its dependence on the government grant and to foster this increasing self-sufficiency by providing access to income streams not available to public corporations and stimulating new efficiencies. And I agree with my honourable friend that British Waterways received more funding, I think he referred to this, than the Canal and River Trust. Indeed, this was the intent in establishing an independent charity to undertake this function. However, it's important that we've got to compare like with like when looking at the evolution of the government funding, because British Waterways, a public corporation, was responsible for the waterways in England, Wales and Scotland, whereas the Canal and Rivers Trust, a charity with access to charitable benefits and tax breaks, is responsible for England and Wales only. I'll just finish this bit. Scottish Canals funding represented £10.5 million in 2011-12, and the existing grant increased by £10 million in 2015-16 and has been inflation adjusted until April 22. So it's then required by the grant agreement to be flat for the final 5 years of the grant period. I'll give away briefly.
Thank you, Sir Robert. I appreciate the Minister setting out the history to the finances, but the point that I just want to reinforce and question is that in the 52.6 billion that the Canal and River Trust is in receipt of, it mustn't be underestimated the huge amount of income streams that they are generating, heading towards that target where the government wants them to get to. I think it's important that the government doesn't lose sight of the £4.6 billion worth of benefits that are coming in various ways. And I would also ask the Minister if she agrees with me that the climate change agenda has changed so much since 2012 that I don't think we're actually comparing apples with apples here.
Yeah.
Thank you. And she makes some sound points, and that's why we're working so closely with the Trust, with the team in DEFRA, to really iron out, what is required, what would be the right rates, the right, tapering or reduction rates, and it's being very, very carefully calculated because the huge benefits are realised, and actually the pressures of climate change are changing things. And remember, of course, that as we've heard, the Canals and Rivers Trust is already attracting in grants from other places, the Levelling Up Fund, the Heritage Fund, Lottery Fund and so forth. Some big grants have come in that way as well. I think I'll have to be very quick because I do want to give my honourable friend a chance to wind up.
Thank you, Sir Robert. I think the Minister's actually hit the nail on the head, but without realising that the grant that the Canal and River Trust receives is an enabling grant to ensure that they can get grants from other sources. And without that enabling grant from the government, probably some of the other grants and other support wouldn't come through. So it just shows how important the government support will continue to be.
Thank you. I don't think anybody denies the importance of the government support, hence so much care is being taken with working out the future of that support. And as my honourable friend noted, the grant was agreed for a period of 15 years from 2012 to 27, and that was to give the Trust a measure of financial stability while working on their other income streams, which they have done very effectively. And that does include maintenance of the canal network, which is a significant part of annual expenditure. And it is the Trust's responsibility to decide on its priorities and consider where it needs to spend its money. We're all aware of the Toddbrook Reservoir Dam incident 3 years ago, which highlighted how essential it is to have safety at the forefront as a top priority of Waterways, and I know that that will remain the case. And the grant agreement requires that a review of the Trust grant is carried out at the 10-year point, which is what my department is currently completing, and looking with a laser focus at all of the issues that have been raised and scrutinising the Trust performance to date. Has the grant been value for money, and the case for the continued funding into the future. And we are working very closely, as has been said. The review was concluded and was due indeed to report by July the 1st. There have been a range of extraneous influences, which were referred to politely, I think, by my honourable friends, which have slowed that somewhat, but it is progressing now with speed. I'm unable to comment in detail further on the outcomes, but it really will be announced forthwith, not shortly, forthwith, and I will, and the whole department involved in this will continue to work with the new chair, David Orr, and I'm very much looking forward to meeting him and indeed going out on some more visits with them. So in closing, I'd really like to thank my honourable friend for raising this subject today, but really I think exposing, and all colleagues, honourable friends and members, giving not just their insights and the joys of canals, but actually really getting to the nub of I think what is concerning people. The funding is obviously of paramount importance. We have to get that right, which is why time is being taken over it. The announcement will be made as soon as possible. And in the meantime, you know, I wish the Trust all the best with all that really great work they're doing. And I don't think anybody for a minute denies the enormous benefits we do get from our canal network.
Wind up, Michael Fabricant.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone who has participated in this debate. I haven't been making a list, but in fact my right honourable friend, the Minister, did. So I'd like to thank her for making the list of all those. I think about a dozen people participated in all. And I would like to thank all the parties that were involved, and especially, as I say, the Minister for doing this. I was feverishly looking up the meaning of forthwith, but I didn't get that far, or immediately, or in the near future. Clearly, it is immensely important, and I think the Minister knows. I'm going to embarrass her by saying she's nodding, I think, in agreement with me. I think everyone here realises the importance for the Canal and River Trust to have some idea as to what their grant will be after March 2027 when it terminates, because they do need to plan which canals remain open. And as I gave the example with the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, we don't want to see any of our canals closing. I think it was Joni Mitchell who said you only, I'll start singing it in a moment, you only realise what you've missed when it's gone. So take paradise and make it a parking lot. And that we don't want to see happening to our canals and waterways. But we do need some certainty. And I am a little disappointed, though I understand the reasons why the Minister couldn't give some certainty today. But I'm sure that forthwith means not a year from now or 2 years from now. I'm sure that forthwith doesn't even mean 3 months from now. I would hope that forthwith means within a few weeks we will learn precisely what grant the Canal and River Trusts will be given. Because it's only once they know that can they plan ahead. And only by planning ahead will we be able to maintain such an important element of our national heritage.